I was just listening to a podcast this morning by Grant Scott, and it's the United Nations of Photography, and I am a guest on that once a month. But today I was not, and he was talking about how he is not a fan of photo contests, and this is an area where he and I violently disagree. I think it's, I think he is incredibly misguided here. And we argue about it all the time. But one of the things he said was judges tend to choose photos that are most like their own style. And if I may use coarse American language, I think that's bullshit. In fact, when he said that, it led me to think about one of the last contests I judged, which was for Show LA. And, my background, being the editor of Life magazine, and Life.com is in documentary, and mostly with people. And that's what really interests me. And yet in this Show LA contest, I think I looked at, there was a few judges, and we each looked at something like 500 submissions from 500 different photographers. And the one that I chose was by a photographer named Camelia Gorini. And her images were of the inside of homes that were totally absent of people. And it felt like they were architectural and they were interior based, and you could feel the absence of people. You could feel like not ghosts, but you could feel histories of, I don't know, it made me wonder, like, who lived there, who laughed there, who loved there, who died there, who fought there, what happened there. And the pictures were so evocative that they were my choice, even though they were very different from the kind of thing I usually go for.
Welcome back, everybody, to a new episode of Eyeshot 50mm. And today it's a very, very real pleasure to welcome back Bill Shapiro to the Eyeshot 50mm series. Bill hardly needs an introduction from writer, editor, former editor-in-chief of Life.com, co-founder right now of BluePhoto.com, and one of the most influential voices in photography publishing today. After joining us last year, he's back as a juror for the Eyeshot Open Call 2026. And this time, rather than talking about his journey, which you guys can find in the older episode we did with Bill, available on YouTube, we'll talk about the responsibility of juror, the role of editors, and also how photographers and book can ultimately find their place within our visual culture. So Bill, thank you so much for being with me today, and welcome back.
Thanks. I'm really glad to be back and always happy to speak with you.
Nice. I love that. Thank you. And just a very small message before we start, to keep liking and keep subscribing, because again, what's a very small click to you, it means the world for us. And since a couple of months now, all our interviews are available as podcasts on all major broadcasting platforms. So now, Bill, let's actually have the fun part. And I would like to begin with your role as a juror in the Eyeshot Open Call 2026, because thousands of photographers will submit their photograph and hoping, I guess, that their work will succeed and arrive at the top, or as finalists at least. So the very, very first question I have for you is, have you ever encountered a body of work that was, let's say, far from your personal taste, but that actually you found nevertheless that felt it deserved to get recognition?
I am so glad you asked me that question. And I'll tell you why. Because I was just listening to a podcast this morning by Grant Scott, and it's the United Nations of Photography, and I am a guest on that once a month. But today I was not, and he was talking about how he is not a fan of photo contests, and this is an area where he and I violently disagree. I think he is incredibly misguided here. and we argue about it all the time. But one of the things he said was, judges tend to choose photos that are most like their own style. And if I may use coarse American language, I think that's bullshit. In fact, when he said that, it led me to think about one of the last contests I judged, which was for Show LA. And, my background, being the editor of Life magazine, and Life.com is in documentary, and mostly with people. And that's what really interests me. And yet in this Show LA contest, I think I looked at, there was a few judges, and we each looked at something like 500 submissions from 500 different photographers. And the one that I chose was by a photographer named Camelia Gorini. And her images were of the inside of homes that were totally absent of people. And it felt like they were architectural and they were interior based, and you could feel the absence of people. You could feel like not ghosts, but you could feel histories of, I don't know, it made me wonder, like, who lived there, who laughed there, who loved there, who died there, who fought there, what happened there. And the pictures were so evocative that they were my choice, even though they were very different from the kind of thing I usually go for.
Exactly, because it's never really about like personal taste. Like I guess it's subjective, but there are certain things that I guess can hit home, close to home in a way.
I mean, for me, it's always, and I think I said this the last time we spoke, I'm looking for pictures that make me feel something. And
Exactly.
that emotion can be joy or regret or nostalgia or curiosity or fear or hatred or anything. But I really want to feel something. And so any picture that can make me, catch my breath a little bit is what I'm looking for.
And is there something you think photographers consistently misunderstood about the way juries actually work?
Most of the time, when I hear from photographers after a contest, they're unhappy because they didn't win. Now, everybody has to understand that a lot of people are entering, and there's maybe 5 or 6 or winners, first, second, third. So it's a little bit of a biased sample, but I feel like photographers believe that jurors are looking for pictures like their own, like Grant said. And I feel sometimes like they don't feel like jurors understand the work that they're doing. Like it's too complicated for the juror to understand it. And they're not really getting where I'm coming from. And, I do hear that quite a bit. Or jurors are looking for something more conventional, less experimental. So those are the sort of things I hear. And, the only truth I think that there is to that, to me, gets kind of revealed in the artist's statement that accompanies the photo work. And sometimes there can be a photo that, I don't know, it is a glass of water, very well done. But the text talks about, this is bridging the boundaries between light and dark and sexual identity and racial identity and past and present and the liminal space. And it's hard to get that from the photo and from the photo itself. And for me, if I have to read 4 paragraphs to understand what you're doing with the picture, then I don't think the picture is communicating well enough. I should be able to understand the picture or get a sense of the picture without having to read 4 paragraphs.
That's such a very precious advice, and I really hope like it gets true to everybody who's watching. And if you could ask all participants just one thing to keep in mind when submitting their work, what would it be?
I don't think I can say one thing. I can say a couple things.
I love it.
Okay. So I would say, just to follow on with what I was just talking about, I would say keep your descriptions short and tightly written. And one reason is, us judges are looking at a lot of work and asking us to read a few hundred words on top of looking at your 12 photographs is a lot. So I would keep your writing very sharp. You don't have to use a lot of fancy words, a lot of fancy art speak curator words, and just tell us where you're coming from and what led you to make these pictures. That's number one. I would say the other thing is avoid cliches, because we'll be looking at 400 photographs more. And if you think that your picture of a red umbrella in a crowded street at golden hour, as beautiful as it is going to stand out for us, is going to be unlike every other photograph of a red umbrella at golden hour, you're probably wrong. So show us something that you don't think we'll see again and again and again. And really, I would say avoid cliches.
Exactly. Also, I feel like it's hard for sure, for everybody who wants to become a photographer to find their own style when we are in a genre that it's been, let's say, repeating itself quite a bit, not necessarily in a negative way, but that's the point, finding a voice that stands out, I guess.
Yeah. I understand that there's nothing new. People say there's nothing new, and that photos come from other photos, just like movies come from other movies. But you have to somehow, the point of all this is to communicate the essence of who you are and speak to that heart through your picture. And that's what will make it individual and not cliche.
Exactly, and standing out. Perfect. Now I want to switch gears a little bit, and I really want to talk about editing, because much of your work has been editing, apart from being curator and co-founder of BluePhoto.com right now. And I feel like photography usually celebrates, rightfully so, the person behind the camera, but behind many important bodies of work, there's also someone that helps shaping it, guiding it in a way as well, and give meaning to those photographs too. So the very first question I have for you is, why has photography traditionally celebrated photographers more than editors? And it's a bit provocative as well, but I want to discuss this with you.
I mean, to me, that makes perfect sense, because the photographer is the one who is, without the photographer, there is no editor. So,
absolutely.
So the pictures, or, I was also a magazine editor working with words. The stories have to come from somewhere. And so, to me, I like when somebody says, "Oh, that was well edited," or good choice of photos. But really, the editors are nothing without the original photos coming in. So all praise to the photographers. At the same time, I work with, I help photographers make their books, and I help them work on their portfolios and their stories. And so often a photographer, might spend 7 years or 5 years or 3 months working on a story. They know the backstory and the context of every image. So they know that this picture of a mother who's crying, as they're holding their sick child, they know everything about that mother. And so it's harder for them to necessarily choose an effective photo for somebody who knows nothing about that mother. And that's where the editor comes in. The editor comes in as a proxy, as a stand-in for the reader or the viewer. And we try to put ourselves in the viewer's shoes, coming to it completely without context, and help choose the photos that most concisely and most effectively tell that story.
And do you think then that editing can be considered like an artistic practice then?
Yes. Sometimes I work with a photographer on a book, and I'll ask them to send me, all their pictures from the project, 600 pictures, and the story that I end up, the sequence and the edit that I end up doing is not one that they expected. And that's where I'm coming from. That's my artistic fingerprint on their work. And they may like it, or they may not, or we may discuss it. But for me, editing is a very creative act. And a very artistic
act. Exactly. And it's interesting that you mentioned, because I wanted also to ask you if you ever had disagreement with the photographers about maybe the strongest image in the project, and what did that disagreement reveal?
That happens very often. And I guess it reveals two perspectives. It reveals the perspective of the person who took the picture, who was there at the moment, and who knows how important that unfolding moment was. And then it also reflects the point of view of a person who may be looking at this image 4 years, 5 years after it was taken, not in a small village in Africa, but in the mountain village of New Mexico. And, there can be conflict there.
And as an editor, how do you then recognize the moment when further editing can no longer clarify the work, but begin, I guess, to weaken it?
That is a great question.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and there is such a thing as over editing, for sure. And this is I see this most often with written stories, because what happens in a written story that goes in a magazine is that your editor, I'll write it, for example, my editor will do an edit on it, and then her editor will do another edit, and then the top editor will do another edit. And by the time you're there, you're like, what's going on? Whose story is this? This is confusing. So sometimes it really is the fewer hands, the better. The fewer hands touching the photo story, the better. At the same time, I photo edited and then wrote the text for a piece that was by a photo story by Richard Sharam, who spent a year with the Dallas, Texas Homicide Division. And I was writing about that for Texas Monthly Magazine. I chose the photos. They were really happy with the selection. The story worked out great. The photographer was happy with it. And then at the last minute, the art director added one more spread. And it was pulled back, and it showed the city, and it was very unexpected, and it just helped the entire package come together. And you really need that sometimes. And as soon as I saw what she did, I was like, brilliant. That's it. She did it.
I love that. There is one thing about photographers and arts photography in general, of course, is that people, I feel like, quite often talk about talent as if it were the defining quality of a photographer. And that's the first thing. But when you look at long careers rather than, I guess, individual photographs, talent alone rarely seems to actually explain why some photographers continue to grow and why others maybe stop evolving, I guess we could say it like that. So looking back over your career in that sense, what personal quality have you found to be more valuable than talent, which sometimes is such a random word and random way of describing? I don't know if it makes sense.
Well, beauty and talent are sort of in the eye of the beholder. I think you and I both have, good taste, visual taste, but the pictures that you love might be different from the ones I love.
Yeah.
So talent is fleeting and ephemeral. It's sometimes hard to put your finger on it. But I think, to answer your question, when I think about the photographers who I think have been really successful, they do a couple things in addition to taking good pictures. Some of that is relationships. It's creating relationships with your fellow photographers, with editors, with book publishers, with gallery owners. It's creating a web of relationships. Those people over years, this does not happen in 3 months, but over years, you'll get a phone call from somebody saying, "Hey, I heard of a project that might be interesting to you. I can't do it, but this may, or you're a fashion. I don't know anything about fashion. You do So that's one thing. The other thing is to be a strong communicator. And that has to do with relationships, but that has to do with being able to explain your work, but it also has to do with communicating either with your editor or with your client. Explain what's going on. Don't surprise them and say, "Oh, you know what? We couldn't get the model that we wanted, so we used my sister, and here's the pictures." Communicate very well about the work, about the process, about who you are and what you're going for. That communication, I think, also spills into social media. The way you communicate about yourself and communicate about your work. And then finally, be a good person. Don't be a jerk. Allow people to trust you. Do favors for people without expecting anything in return. Help younger people, or not younger, but less experienced people. Help older people who are extremely talented but maybe have fallen off the radar. And just be a good person. It will come back to you.
Absolutely. I feel like the last one, it's the best advice, and I feel like everybody should do it more, like to help each other. We're all in this together, I guess. So it's about community.
Yeah, it is about community, and it's not, if you win, it doesn't mean that I lose. And it's like we can help each other
Absolutely.
over years. So I'm all about that.
Have you ever seen instead photographers become trapped by the very, let's say, approach that first made them successful? In the sense of at what point in time does consistency, I guess, turn into repetition?
Yeah. I'm so glad you asked that, because the one thing that was going through my head was I didn't talk about flexibility. I think to be a successful photographer in the long term, you do need to be flexible. You need to be able to change with the times. Now, there's still that core of you, which is, chasing after a certain way of expressing something, or a certain, the way you see the world is your signature. But, what comes to mind is in the late 80s, I worked at a magazine, and there was a photographer who shot with a fisheye lens. And this was a commercial magazine, and he shot very commercial things. It could be, cows for a story about milk, but everything was a fish. And for a couple of years, he did great. He did, because everybody liked that style. They associated it with him. But then it got to be old hat, and it started to feel like a gimmick, and he started to feel like a one-trick pony. And you don't see his work today at all, anywhere.
Anymore. Exactly.
So I think, the role of staying curious about new subject matter and new processes of shooting that, and new ways to approach things, is really important. And even if that doesn't become your main work, if you're doing more experimental work, or at least pushing your own boundaries on the side, I think that will help your more commercial expected published photography improve and keep current as well.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Whether judging, whether editing a book, publishing a story, writing, your career, I feel like, has largely been built around making not decision, but choices, making choices, or making choices. I think that's better.
Well,
and
that's
every
when
choice,
an editor makes a choice
exactly.
every time he or she looks at something.
Exactly. And choices exactly inevitably means leaving something out or behind or something like that. Throughout your career, you've made thousands of creative choices. Has spending a lifetime choosing changed the way you think about decision making itself? In your role as editor, we could say.
That's such an interesting question, and I've never been asked that before, so thank you. I've worked on Life.com, for example, was a daily website that was updated multiple times a day. So you're making choices in real time constantly. And I think the thing that I learned is that you can make a quick choice, and to listen to your gut a little bit and not to overthink it. Because if you spend 6 hours making a choice, there's an opportunity cost to that. You won't be able to make other choices. Now, if you're choosing what image would be the cover of your book, that's a different story. There are some choices, and I guess this is really the key thing, and I guess this is maybe how I would answer the question if I had thought about it first. There are two kinds of choices. One, some that can be made quickly, and there's not a lot of ramifications if you get it slightly wrong. And then there are some that you should really take your time. And there are much fewer of the latter. It's kind of, I don't know if you know the 80-20 rule, but it's like, it's like you really need to spend most of your time not making every decision, but spend it on the most important decisions that people will come to think about. If you have the cover of your book, if you think about the Americans for a book that the cover of the book, the trolley, that sort of says it all. And that was a great decision. And who knows how long it took to make that decision. But when I make a decision for the cover of a book, I sit on it for a long time, and I look at multiple different things. I'll ask other people for their opinions sometimes, and those are the decisions that I spend time on. Some of the other ones go quickly.
And is there anything that the photograph you decided not to choose have taught you about the one that instead you selected?
Tell me what you mean.
In the sense of the photograph you decided not to choose for a story, for the editing of a book, taught you anything about the one that instead you selected, like why you selected those, or the reasons why you kind of not justify, I cannot find the right word, but explain.
Explain. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there is, as we've talked about, this sort of gut level. Do you get an emotional hit from it? But there are other factors to consider sometimes, like with a magazine cover. It's kind of like a known thing that if you're that eye contact on a magazine cover is important. When we brought Life magazine back, our cover subject was Sarah Jessica Parker, and it was shot by the great photographers Anise and Vinood. And I was presented with a few potential pictures to choose, And I ended up choosing one with the help of my photo director, George Pitts, where her eyes were closed and she was kind of looking down. And it was beautiful and it was different and surprising. And I got in trouble from my boss, the head of Time Inc., because he was like, eye contact, eye contact, eye contact. And I said, I want to show that this magazine is going to do something a little different and it's going to surprise you, and you won't know what to expect every story, every issue. And so so that was the basis of that decision.
I love that. And that's exactly what I was pointing out. Like, I wanted to get out of you, and you always have a great answer. And I think this was also a really great answer.
Well,
honestly, it is something. Yeah. Photography doesn't exist, at least how I feel, it doesn't exist in isolation, in the sense that every image, especially nowadays, travels through a wider ecosystem of anything, as you said also before, editors, publishers, social media, museums as well, festivals, audience, any kind of things. And I'm curious to know how you see this ecosystem today. So the very first question I have for you connects to the fact that 50 years ago, perhaps magazines, and you know this very well, played a central role in shaping photography, or not in shaping, but in sharing it, at least. Today, instead, the influence is spread across
I would also say I would say shaping it.
Okay,
because,
perfect.
You know, when you have a magazine cover, and I know Life magazine the best, and here's actually, you know, here's like an old, you know, you had this logo, you know, you had this logo in the left corner, and that took up about that much room. And so photographers who wanted to have their picture on the cover of Life had to shoot their subjects in a certain way, because this wasn't going to move. And so you could see the person's face here, you know, so it actually did literally shape the way pictures were made.
And interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Anyway, sorry to interrupt you.
No, please. That was fantastic. And today, instead, I was saying this influence, it's a bit different, apart from publisher, festival, but social media, the algorithm, especially, that we're all being subjected to. Has photography then become more democratic or simply more fragmented?
Well, I think both are true, which is a contradiction. But I mean, if you think about news, not about photography, but I think the same is true. If you think about news, there are more people writing about the news and commenting on the news, Instagram, TikTok, you know, Threads, X, whatever, than ever before. You know, everybody essentially writes a letter to the editor now all the time, and they're citizen journalists. And yet, so there's more news out there. At the same time, you know, your point is the algorithm. I only see a small section of that, based on my particular political leanings, and the same is true of photography on Instagram and TikTok and Threads and Facebook. You know, you see what you have liked before. You see what you have shown an interest in before. And so, you know, something I do on Instagram to try to break that up and to try to not confuse the algorithm, but to expand the algorithm, is sometimes I'll like things that I don't actually like.
Interesting.
Because I do want to see other, you know, other things and other kinds of photography. So I think your question's really good, and I think the answer is strangely both.
Strangely both. I love it. And also there is this thing that I feel like editors have been for years, let's say, the primary gatekeepers of photography in this sense. But now in such a fragmented visual culture, then is the role now less about controlling access, but more about creating context or space for people to emerge?
People use the word gatekeepers as if it's a bad thing. And
no, exactly.
And I'm sure a lot of your listeners, you know, when they hear the word gatekeeper, it's almost like hearing the word colonialism or something like, it's
Yeah.
it's a trigger word. But I actually think if there were no gatekeepers, you would be flooded with so much information you wouldn't even know where to look. So
Absolutely.
I don't I don't know how everybody else is thinking about gatekeepers, but I think of gatekeepers as being editors in a way.
Yeah, they have their responsibility. I also see it not as a negative way. They have kind of like a responsibility to create this space for these people, like you did in life, like you did now also with BluePhoto.com in the same way. So like once it was easier to recognize that they were gatekeepers, I guess, compared to now.
Maybe. So on my Instagram feed on most Fridays, I try to show the work of a photographer that people haven't heard of. Kind of like an introduction to the photographer, kind of I call it Meet This Photographer. So am I a gatekeeper? Yes. Are there a lot of people whose work I don't cover? Yes. But for the people who I do shine a light on, people tend to be excited to see somebody new that they couldn't have found before. And so, hopefully I'm providing a bright light on certain people that, would have kind of flown under the radar.
Absolutely. And I think I saw it one a couple of weeks ago that I really, truly love it. And this great photographer. And he actually contacted us and be like, oh, thank you. And I got it to know from you. And it was beautiful work that turned into a book. Now, I don't really remember the exact name and I don't want to say anything wrong, but it was beautiful. So thank you for that. And I totally agree with that. Changing questions, because I feel like we kind of like eviscerated it. In this ecosystem driven by visibility and speed, who still has the responsibility to make space for work that instead requires attention and slowness? I feel like what you do on Instagram with this series of reposting photographers, it's also part of this, of like slowing down. You also write very interesting captions full of information, so you're not just leaving it to the mystery or actually describing the work. So who has the responsibility, apart from you, no, I'm just joking, the responsibility to make space for this work that requires time and attention?
I think anybody who's been fortunate in photography, in the world of photography, and I certainly have, the chance to be associated with Life magazine and to be able to go through those archives and meet those photographers and understand that and live with that history, not only was an honor, but I feel very lucky to have done that. I think anybody who has been lucky or fortunate in any way has the responsibility to kind of pay it forward. And you don't have to do it all the time. You don't have to do it every day or every week. It doesn't have to be this big. It could be this big. But if you've been lucky, help somebody else get lucky.
Exactly, 100%. Very final question on this section, and then I'll move to something else. Today, is it becoming harder for original work to emerge, or is it simply harder to be noticed?
What's the difference?
Interesting. I guess there's no difference, you say.
I mean, it does. Noticed means, oh, I saw that, and emerge means, it got a gallery show, or tell me how you're.
Yeah, exactly. Like maybe I've been talking to quite a lot of photographers lately since the series as well. And there were a couple of ones that always told me, I thought once it would be enough to do good work to be discovered in a way. But because this ecosystem that we've been talking about has shifted things, is it maybe harder to then get noticed in this big pool of like people, photographers? Everybody can be a photographer, just having an account on Instagram.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of about the signal to noise ratio. There's a lot of noise out there.
Yeah.
there are a million photo books being made, and not all of them are great. So it is, in some ways, well, in all ways, it's easier to get your photos seen today. But it is harder to get people to stop and pay attention and think, oh, who was that photographer? Let's see about their previous work. And I guess for me, it's, I think if we look back on, at least a couple hundred years, not just photography, but all art, it's
Yeah.
never just about being talented. People need to have some level of charisma or something that lets people associate them with the work. If you think about, and this is maybe gimmicky, but if you think about a writer like Tom Wolfe, very, very, very talented. He also only wore white suits. If you think about Andy Warhol, very, very, very talented, but also had that hair and the whole thing. So, artists have always done things to try to separate themselves from the pack. And so I don't think in general that's different, but I do think there's a lot more noise now. And so I think photographers need to be more strategic in again, as I was talking about before, their relationships, and the full frame of their career, not just the photo, but who do they help? Who do they talk to? Who do they do favors for? That kind of thing.
Okay. We've talked about judging, editing, books, choices, and all the decisions that shape photography. I'd like to finish by stepping back a little bit and ask you what all of this might mean beyond our own time. So when the future generations look back at the photography from the 2020s, what do you think they will understand about us?
What an interesting question. I think they'll see that we were obsessed with our, if you're looking at street photographs, if an alien from a different planet or 100 years from now, I think they're looking at street photographs, they'll see that we were fascinated by our phones and that everybody was looking at their phone all the time. I think that they'll see that we were fascinated, for at least for a while, by identity, and who we are as people. I think that they will, there's so many great ways to answer this question. I think that they will see the tension that's kind of bubbling up with AI image making, for sure. What else will they know about us? I mean, I think, they will, if they see not just the images, but the number of images, they'll understand that we have become a very visually oriented society that feels like we need to save moments many, many times a day.
Absolutely. I love this. Very final one. After a lifetime of looking and helping photographers enter the world, what still has the power to surprise you? Even though I might know the answer, but I would love to hear from you.
Yeah. I mean, there's a few different things. So the question is, what surprises me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I always love finding pictures about a time and a place that I knew nothing about. And I can tell you a story about one, which is maybe one of the most fun things I've worked on for the last couple of years. And it actually weaves in a few of the things we've been talking about in terms of emerging and noticing and your algorithm and paying things forward. So a couple years ago, someone sent me a DM on Instagram. So I didn't know this person. They follow me, but I didn't know them at all. And it just said, "Oh, you might want to look at this photographer. I think you'll like it. And I looked, and in fact, I did like it. She had maybe 24 photographs, a few dozen photographs online, and maybe 50 followers. So she was not a big name. But the pictures were taken near where I live in northern New Mexico. And I got in touch with the photographer, and she told me the story about where these pictures came from. And she's 83 now. But when she was 26 or so, she was this, hippie chick living in San Francisco, and she and some friends moved out to northern New Mexico. This little, and this is in the early 70s, this little traditional Catholic Hispanic village, no stoplights, one store, that's it. 200 people live there. And she started making pictures of when these two cultures came together, the Anglos and the Hispanic locals. And I felt there was, in speaking with her, she told me that the photos had never been seen before. They kind of got put in her basement. She told me that nobody else in that town had enough money to buy a camera. It was a very poor town. So these were the only photographs of that place and during that time. And so we ended up making a book about it called, and so we moved to Petaca, and we got it published with the University of New Mexico Press. And we got a gallery show at the Obscura Gallery in Santa Fe. And so here was this little moment in time, forgotten for 50 years, that we brought back into the world. And that's the kind of surprise that I love and that really excites me.
I love that. I got goosebumps. So it's such an interesting story, and that's the only record you guys have of that moment and that place in time, and that's unbelievable.
Yeah, and like today that would never happen because everybody's shooting. But those, so that's not going to happen in the future. But years ago, there are lots of moments like that, lots of things that went either uncaptured or captured by a single photographer. And I find that kind of exciting.
It's super exciting. I got excited myself. Bill, honestly, I want to thank you so much. It's always so inspiring and so interesting talking to you. And I hope I see you one day in person. And I want to thank you once again for being with me today.
Well, I really appreciate such smart questions. It's really fun to talk about photography with you. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And a very small message before we say goodbye, to keep liking and keep subscribing, because again, what's a very small click to you, it means the world for us to keep bringing you guests such as Bill. Thank you so much again, Bill, and see you soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.